You're checking your phone during lunch break when news alerts start flooding in about the massive reward increase and nationwide expansion of the hunt for one of the country's most wanted fugitives. The announcement came during a somber press conference held jointly by the FBI and local law enforcement agencies. Special Agent Lisa Chen, flanked by officials from 6 different states, revealed that the reward for information leading to David Chen's capture had been increased to $500,000, one of the largest bounties ever offered for a domestic fugitive. The funding came from a combination of federal resources, state contributions, and private donations from concerned citizens across the country. After nearly 2 weeks of intensive searching, we are expanding our operation to include all 50 states, Agent Chen announced to a packed room of reporters and law enforcement officials. David Chen should be considered armed and extremely dangerous, and we believe he may have traveled far beyond our initial search parameters. The decision to go nationwide came after surveillance footage from a truck stop in Nevada showed a figure matching David's description, though the image was too grainy for positive identification. The search had consumed enormous resources over the past 12 days. Over 800 law enforcement officers from multiple agencies had participated in the manhunt, covering thousands of square miles across 3 states. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging had scanned remote wilderness areas, while ground teams with tracking dogs had followed dozens of potential leads through difficult terrain. But David had proven more elusive than investigators had anticipated. His 6-hour head start had allowed him to disappear completely, and despite the massive effort, no confirmed sightings had been reported since the initial surveillance footage from the truck stop. Phone records showed his devices had been turned off within hours of his escape, eliminating digital tracking possibilities. The reward increase reflected both the desperation of the investigation and the growing public interest in the case. Tips had been pouring in from across the country, over 3,000 calls in the first week alone. Each tip required investigation, stretching resources thin as agents worked around the clock to verify information and follow leads that too often turned into dead ends. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who had been leading the local investigation since the first victim was discovered, addressed the emotional toll on investigators and victim families. "Every day he remains free is another day the families can't find peace," she said, her voice steady but strained. "We will not stop searching until he's brought to justice." Now people are wondering, when someone vanishes completely despite a massive search effort, how long can they really stay hidden? The decision to expand the manhunt nationwide was based on more than just the possible Nevada sighting. FBI analysts had been working around the clock to profile David's likely escape strategies and potential destinations, creating a complex picture of someone who had clearly prepared for this scenario long before executing his crimes. Behavioral analysis suggested David possessed survival skills and planning capabilities that made him particularly dangerous as a fugitive. His abandoned apartment had revealed camping equipment purchases dating back several months, along with detailed maps of national parks and wilderness areas across the western United States. Investigators theorized he might be using remote locations to avoid populated areas where he could be recognized. The financial investigation provided additional clues about his possible range of movement. Bank records showed David had been withdrawing cash in small amounts for over 6 months before his escape, accumulating what investigators estimated to be between $15,000 in untraceable currency. This amount could sustain someone living off the grid for several months if managed carefully. Credit card analysis from the days before his disappearance revealed purchases that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. He had bought a portable camping stove, water purification tablets, non-perishable food supplies, and outdoor survival gear from different stores across the county. Each purchase had been made in cash, suggesting he understood the importance of avoiding digital trails. Most concerning was evidence that David had been studying law enforcement search procedures. Books on wilderness survival and evasion tactics were found in his apartment, along with printed articles about famous fugitives and their capture methods. A notebook contained detailed observations about police patrol patterns in his neighborhood, and notes about surveillance blind spots around the city. The nationwide expansion also reflected growing concern about David's psychological state after nearly 2 weeks on the run. Dr. Sarah Kim, consulting with the FBI's behavioral unit, warned that the stress of being hunted could lead to increasingly desperate and dangerous behavior. Extended periods of isolation and constant fear of capture can cause significant psychological deterioration, she explained during a briefing with law enforcement officials. This makes him potentially more volatile and unpredictable. Interstate coordination presented its own challenges, as different agencies worked to share information and resources effectively. The FBI had established a centralized command center to coordinate tips and sightings from multiple states, but the sheer volume of information was overwhelming existing systems. How do you effectively coordinate a search across an entire country when the fugitive could be anywhere? The massive reward announcement triggered an unprecedented response from the public, but it also created new challenges for investigators as the volume of tips and reported sightings skyrocketed beyond their ability to process effectively. Within 24 hours of the reward increase, tip lines received over 2,000 new calls, forcing the FBI to establish additional call centers and bring in personnel from other field offices. The quality of tips varied dramatically, from credible sightings with specific details to obvious hoaxes and attention-seeking calls. Trained analysts worked to categorize each report, prioritizing those with verifiable information while still ensuring that potentially legitimate leads weren't overlooked. The process required careful balance. Dismissing too many tips could mean missing the crucial lead, but following every false report was depleting resources needed for legitimate investigations. Several tips appeared promising enough to warrant immediate response. A gas station attendant in Colorado reported serving a customer who matched David's description and seemed nervous when asked for identification. Security footage from the location was rushed to FBI analysts, though image quality made positive identification difficult. Similar reports came from Arizona, Utah, and Oregon, each requiring teams of agents to investigate. The reward money had attracted professional bounty hunters and amateur investigators who began conducting their own searches. While some offered legitimate assistance, others interfered with official investigations or put themselves and others at risk by approaching potentially dangerous situations without proper training. Law enforcement officials found themselves issuing warnings about civilian vigilante efforts while trying to maintain productive relationships with credible volunteer searchers. Social media amplified both helpful and harmful aspects of the expanded search. Facebook groups dedicated to finding David grew to include tens of thousands of members sharing tips, theories, and alleged sightings. While some information proved valuable, these platforms also spread misinformation and conspiracy theories that complicated official investigations. False sightings went viral, causing unnecessary panic in communities hundreds of miles from credible leads. The psychological impact on communities where credible sightings were reported proved significant. Towns that had never heard of David suddenly found themselves flooded with law enforcement officers, media crews, and bounty hunters. Local businesses reported both increases in activity from the influx of searchers and decreases from residents who stayed home out of fear. The families of David's victims watched the expanding search with mixed emotions. While they appreciated the increased resources and attention, each false lead meant another day without closure. Patricia Thompson, Jessica's mother, expressed the frustration felt by many. "We're grateful for everyone trying to help, but every time we think there's a break in the case, it turns out to be nothing. We just want him found so we can start healing." When a massive search effort generates thousands of tips but no confirmed results, how do you maintain hope that justice will eventually be served? As the nationwide manhunt entered its third week, investigators began examining whether David might be receiving help from unknown accomplices or sympathizers. The ability to remain hidden for so long despite massive law enforcement attention suggested either exceptional survival skills or assistance from individuals who hadn't yet been identified. Analysis of David's background revealed limited social connections, but investigators couldn't rule out the possibility of relationships they hadn't discovered. Phone records from the months before the crimes showed communication with several numbers that investigators were still working to trace. Some of these contacts had been made through encrypted messaging apps that made identification difficult, raising questions about who else might know about his crimes or current whereabouts. The investigation expanded to include David's extended family members, former co-workers, and acquaintances from his past. While most interviews revealed limited knowledge of his activities or whereabouts, a few individuals provided information that concerned investigators. A former co-worker mentioned David's interest in survivalist topics and his knowledge of remote wilderness areas. An ex-girlfriend recalled him talking about disappearing completely if he ever needed to start over. Financial investigators discovered that David had been researching methods for accessing money while avoiding detection. Internet searches on his devices showed queries about cryptocurrency, offshore banking, and methods for converting cash into untraceable assets. This suggested he might have prepared financial resources that investigators hadn't yet identified, potentially extending his ability to remain hidden indefinitely. The possibility of assistance raised questions about potential charges for anyone found to be helping David evade capture. Federal law enforcement made it clear that harboring a fugitive, providing material support, or interfering with the investigation would result in serious criminal charges. Public service announcements emphasized that helping David in any way would be considered a federal crime with severe penalties. Professional fugitive recovery experts consulted by the FBI offered insights into how someone could remain hidden for extended periods. Most emphasized the importance of avoiding digital communications, staying away from populated areas, and having access to resources for basic survival needs. The fact that David appeared to be succeeding at these strategies suggested either extensive preparation or ongoing assistance. Surveillance of locations where David might seek help continued around the clock. Known associates, former addresses, and places with personal significance remained under observation, though investigators acknowledged that he might have connections they hadn't discovered. The challenge was balancing thorough investigation of known leads with the possibility that the most important connections remained unknown. Law enforcement agencies began offering immunity deals to anyone with information about David's whereabouts, emphasizing that cooperation would be viewed favorably even if it involved admitting to previous assistance. The strategy aimed to encourage people who might be hesitant to come forward due to fear of prosecution. When someone manages to stay hidden this long, how do you determine whether it's exceptional planning or criminal assistance from others? The extended manhunt began taking a significant toll on the investigators, victim families, and communities involved in the search. 3 weeks of intensive investigation with no confirmed sightings created a unique form of psychological pressure that affected everyone connected to the case. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who had been working virtually around the clock since the investigation began, showed visible signs of the stress during daily briefings. Dark circles under her eyes and a hoarse voice reflected the physical demands of coordinating with federal agencies while maintaining local investigation responsibilities. Her department had received offers of assistance from neighboring jurisdictions, but the complexity of the case made it difficult to bring new investigators up to speed quickly. FBI agents rotated in and out of the investigation to prevent burnout, but core team members like Agent Chen had remained constant throughout the search. The psychological pressure of knowing that David remained free while potentially planning additional attacks created an urgency that made rest difficult even when officially off duty. Family members of agents reported that the case had become an obsession that followed investigators home each night. The victim families struggled with the prolonged uncertainty in different ways. Some found hope in the expanded search efforts and increased reward money, interpreting these developments as signs that David would eventually be captured. Others began expressing frustration with the lack of concrete progress, questioning whether enough was being done to find him. Support groups formed among the families, but even these gatherings often focused more on the ongoing manhunt than on healing from their losses. Media coverage of the case evolved as the story stretched beyond the typical news cycle. Initial intense coverage began to fade as other stories competed for attention, leaving victim families feeling forgotten despite the ongoing investigation. Some family members began conducting their own media outreach, appearing on national television programs to keep attention focused on the search for David. Communities where credible sightings had been reported experienced their own form of collective trauma. Residents altered their daily routines, avoided outdoor activities, and installed additional security measures even after law enforcement teams moved on to investigate leads elsewhere. The psychological impact of knowing a dangerous fugitive might be in their area lingered long after the immediate threat had passed. Small businesses in areas where the search had been concentrated reported mixed economic impacts. Hotels and restaurants saw temporary increases in business from law enforcement officers and media crews, but these gains were often offset by decreased local patronage from residents who stayed home out of caution. Some business owners expressed frustration that their communities had become associated with the manhunt in national media coverage. The financial cost of the extended search was becoming substantial, with estimates suggesting the investigation had already consumed millions of dollars in federal, state, and local resources. Budget officials began questioning how long such an intensive effort could be sustained, though no one was willing to publicly suggest reducing the search while David remained at large. When a manhunt stretches on for weeks without results, how do you maintain the intensity and resources needed while managing the psychological and financial costs to everyone involved? As the manhunt approached its 4th week, law enforcement officials began implementing new strategies based on lessons learned from the extended search and input from experts in fugitive psychology and behavior analysis. The case had evolved from a reactive chase into a proactive effort to anticipate David's next moves and force him into situations where capture became more likely. FBI behavioral analysts developed what they called a pressure campaign, designed to make it increasingly difficult for David to remain hidden. This involved publicizing specific details about his likely survival methods, preferred hiding places, and psychological state in hopes that public awareness would eliminate safe havens he might otherwise use. Media releases described his probable appearance changes, survival techniques, and behavioral patterns to help civilians identify him even if he had altered his physical appearance. The strategy included releasing information about David's likely psychological deterioration after weeks of isolation and constant fear of capture. Dr. Sarah Kim explained during a public briefing that extended periods of hiding typically cause significant stress reactions, including paranoia, sleep deprivation, and increasingly poor decision-making. He's probably not thinking as clearly as he was 3 weeks ago, she noted. This creates opportunities for law enforcement, but also makes him potentially more dangerous and unpredictable. Technology played an increasingly important role in the evolved search strategy. Advanced facial recognition systems were deployed at transportation hubs, border crossings, and major retail centers across multiple states. While privacy advocates raised concerns about the broad surveillance implementation, law enforcement officials argued that the public safety threat justified extraordinary measures. The systems were programmed to flag not just David's current appearance, but also likely variations based on possible disguises or physical changes. Psychological warfare tactics were employed through targeted media campaigns designed to increase David's stress and isolation. Messages from victim families were broadcast on local radio stations in areas where he might be hiding, emphasizing the pain his crimes had caused and encouraging him to surrender. Law enforcement officials hoped that constant reminders of his crimes would create additional psychological pressure that might lead to mistakes or surrender. The investigation also focused on disrupting any support networks David might be using. Financial institutions across the country received alerts about transaction patterns that might indicate someone providing assistance to a fugitive. Surveillance was increased at locations where supplies needed for extended wilderness survival could be purchased. The goal was to make it increasingly difficult for David to obtain the resources needed to remain hidden indefinitely. International cooperation expanded the search beyond U.S. borders, with alerts sent to law enforcement agencies in Canada and Mexico. While there was no evidence David had left the country, investigators wanted to prevent international escape if he attempted to cross borders. Immigration and customs officials at all border crossings received detailed briefings about the case and David's possible appearance variations. The expanded strategies reflected a shift from hoping for quick capture to preparing for a potentially extended cat-and-mouse game. Law enforcement officials acknowledged privately that David might remain at large for months, requiring sustained effort and evolving tactics to eventually bring him to justice. When traditional manhunt methods fail to produce results, how far should law enforcement go in using technology and psychological tactics to capture a dangerous fugitive? 1 month into the nationwide manhunt, the case had fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approached fugitive investigations and raised important questions about resource allocation, public safety, and the sustainability of intensive search operations. What began as a local investigation had evolved into one of the most expensive and extensive domestic manhunts in recent history. The financial cost had reached an estimated $12 million, including federal resources, state contributions, overtime payments for local officers, and technology deployments. Budget analysts questioned whether such expenditures could be justified indefinitely, especially as other criminal investigations competed for the same resources. Congressional representatives from affected states called for hearings on fugitive investigation protocols and cost management. Despite the massive effort, David remained at large with no confirmed sightings in over a week. The last credible report had come from a campground in Montana, where a park ranger reported someone matching David's description, but ground searches of the area found no physical evidence of his presence. The false lead consumed 3 days of intensive searching by dozens of officers and cost an estimated $200,000 in resources. Law enforcement agencies began conducting internal reviews of the investigation to identify lessons learned and areas for improvement. The case had revealed gaps in interagency communication, resource allocation inefficiencies, and challenges in managing public information while maintaining operational security. These findings were being incorporated into updated protocols for future fugitive investigations. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate participants to influence how communities across the country thought about personal safety and law enforcement capabilities. Public opinion polls showed decreased confidence in police ability to quickly capture dangerous criminals, while gun sales and home security system installations increased in areas where David had been reportedly sighted. Victim advocacy groups used the case to highlight broader issues about violence against women and the need for improved prevention and response systems. They argued that focusing resources on capturing David was necessary but insufficient if underlying issues that created such predators weren't addressed. Support networks for victim families evolved into advocacy organizations pushing for systemic changes in how such crimes were prevented and investigated. The media coverage had created a new category of public interest in fugitive cases, with social media communities dedicated to amateur investigation and crowdsourced leads. While some contributions proved valuable, the phenomenon also raised concerns about vigilante justice and interference with official investigations. Several incidents occurred where amateur investigators approached potentially dangerous situations without proper training or coordination with law enforcement.